Hi, guys. It's Mr. Miller here. As a part of our International Law and Human Rights Unit, I thought it would be appropriate at this time to talk about Canada's human rights record, how we treat our own citizens, and how we rank kind of internationally. Often, when we think about Canada in terms of human rights, we're often the ones thought of to be on top of the soapbox, pointing our fingers down at other nations, especially our American neighbors to the south. But when we actually look at our own history, how well do we fare? Are we as pure and good and honest as we think we are? When we think about African Canadians, in a survey, it says one third of respondents said they encountered casual or systemic racism regularly. So this could be kind of regular kind of interactions with the police patrols primarily in black neighborhoods, or simply being followed while shopping in a store by an attendant or a security guard. Well, again, this is a common issue for young black males. The former president of the United States, Barack Obama, did speak about his own interaction with store security in a very similar circumstance of being followed. And this was when he was a state senator in the state of Illinois. Uh, Black Canadians have historically faced incarceration rates disproportionate to the size of their population. So it says here it's 10% of the prison population, but they're only 2.9% of the actual population. So much more than their actual kind of proportion of the population. And we have had regular issues with police brutality, and especially with the Metro Toronto Police. Japanese Canadians, one of the most famous examples um, is internment camps. So, after the outbreak of World War II, Japan declaring war on Great Britain, its colonies, Canada included, uh, and a large percentage of the Japanese population living in Western Canada was sent to internment camps. And kind of an offshoot of this, being in a primarily kind of German heritage area like Kitchener, there were no German internment camps, even though the vast majority of Canada's kind of military operations in World War II were centered around Europe at this time. Internment camps were, again, terrible places to live. Again, no running water, no electricity, or proper heating. And remember, again, a lot of these internment camps were located in very rural, isolated parts of British Columbia and Alberta. And Canada obviously is a very cold country. So lacking those basic amenities was not good. Kind of the additional thing that happened unbeknownst to a lot of the population while they were living in internment camps was that their valuables, their homes were sold off at a fraction of their value. So when they returned to their homes after leaving internment camps, um, there was nothing left for them, and they often found another family living in what they thought was their own home. Also, again, there was no voting for Japanese Canadians until 1947, 2 years after the war ends. And there was no official apology from the Canadian government until 1988. Uh, Kind of the depressing kind of reality is that many of those who lived through their experience in internment camps, especially if they were middle aged or older, did not survive long enough to actually hear the apology. LGBTQ Canadians. Um, Prior to 1969, to be gay, homosexual, or again anything other than what, like, again, air quotes, normal, was often considered a criminal offense and a psychological disorder. But it wasn't until, again, 1969 that it's actually decriminalized and taken out of the Canadian criminal code. One of the more famous lines from, again, the current prime minister's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, is that the state has no place in the bedrooms of the people. Um, but just because something is decriminalized doesn't mean people in that particular community don't feel any type of persecution. Uh, the famous Toronto bathhouse raids still happened in 1981. This was, again, police harassment of the gay community in Toronto. There was a very famous Supreme Court case, RV Vrend, where Albertan college professor was fired for being gay. And that does not happen until 1986. Just from our current perspective, GSA clubs, gay straight alliance clubs in schools are regular targets of abuse, vandalism, and violence. And kind of how that represents itself in terms of statistics is rates of suicide are 4 times higher among LGBTQ than their heterosexual or cisgendered peers. Women. So when we're looking demographically at Canada, women make up more than half, 50.4% of the population. Um, but again, the suffragist movement doesn't happen. The enfranchisement movement doesn't happen until the early 20th century. So the rights to vote are often, again, at various times for various provinces. Again, the first province to give the vote is Manitoba in 1916, and the last province to give the vote to women was 1940. The federal vote is given to during World War One, but that was not given for any type of altruistic reasons. It was only given to the wives, sisters, and mothers of soldiers during the 1917 election to ensure Robert Borden's government getting reelected and the passing of the conscription law. The persons case, where women were considered persons under the law and not really the kind of jurisdiction of their father or husband, doesn't happen until 1929, which allowed women to be judges or magistrates, MPs, and senators. And even today, again, the idea of the glass ceiling, again, a kind of permanent top barrier that women can rise to in terms of politics and business. And a good example of this is this woman right here, which again, when I have to do this in class, almost every woman, man and woman in the class fails to identify this person. It's Kim Campbell. It's Canada's only uh, female prime minister, and she had a very short tenure, and her government was actually again defeated massively in the next election. And a lot of people believe part of that failure, that loss, was to her being a woman. And lastly, the income disparity, the idea that a man and a woman of equal backgrounds and equal experience can work the same job, and the man will almost inevitably make more. And lastly, Aboriginal Canadians. Again, the idea that the people that were living in North America prior to the colonization by European powers. People always joke that again, Columbus discovered America or discovered North America, but in reality, there had been people living in here for thousands upon thousands of years. Uh, with the arrival of the European settlers, the original inhabitants, the Aboriginal Canadians, were decimated by disease. The diseases that were not thought to be that bad because European colonizers had all antibodies to fight them off. Those antibodies were not present in Indigenous people. So they were often again wiped out very quickly. They believe almost 90% of the kind of pre-colonial population of indigenous people in North and South America were wiped out by disease. Uh, Again, in more recent history, the forcible kind of movement of indigenous people from their lands to again reservations um, in kind of the 20th century, we have the issue of residential schools, where young Indigenous people were taken away from their families, forced to move to, again, residential or boarding schools, often run by religious organizations, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church in Canada. And again, they were often had their hair cut. They were given new Western or Christian names. Um, Again, they faced again quite terrible treatment in these residential schools. Again, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental abuse. And when we actually look at the statistics, uh, 1 in 25 people that entered residential school would die during their time there. And that's even worse than the death rates of the trenches of World War One, where again it would be 1 in 26 Canadian soldiers would die. And this still manifests itself in the current generation of Indigenous Canadians, where they have higher rates of, again, sexual abuse, drug abuse, and incarceration, where again, Indigenous women only make up about 2% of the population, but 25% of Canadians' prisons. So when we think about and we judge other nations with their treatment of, again, particular groups within their own country, we always have to, again, remember as Canadians, we do have our own dark, sordid past. So when we kind of think and judge other people, we are not the ones on the soapbox, and those other nations have the right, again, and quite rightly have the right to question and identify Canada's own, uh, again, human rights abuses.